Okay, we're almost at the end, but as is now customary, I think, at this conference, we're going to have summation by our good friend and fellow Graham Dobell. Graham, where are you? Oh, he's coming. Good. Okay, Graham is a senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Oh, there it is. And he has had a long and storied career in journalism, which you can read about in our program. And he's also, for the past 4 years or 4 times, has been summing up this conference, and we always invite him back because he's so good at it. So please, Graham.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I always say, I am a journalist and I'm here to help you. And for some reason in this town, that always gets a laugh. So, in my trade, headlines matter. So, consider these AIIA headlines. When this conference gathered in this pub in 2019, its headline was "New Agendas for a New Era." Then the plague came, and COVID meant no conference in 2020 or 2021. We gathered in this room again in 2022. Conference headline, "New Frontiers in Australian Foreign Policy." Still possibly relatively positive. Then last year, "Navigating the Perfect Storm, Australian Foreign Policy and the Poly Crisis." And this year's headline, "Facing Fragmentation, Possibilities and Partnerships in a Fragile World." So over 6 years and 4 conferences, we have gone from New Era and New Frontiers to Perfect Storm, Polycrisis and the fragmentation of a fragile world. And add to that this headline from the book that was launched here today, the 13th volume in Australia and World Affairs. And I would say to you, 13 volumes over nearly 75 years. This series is one of those wonderful contributions of the Institute to Australia and Australian foreign policy. This is a wonderful living monument to Australian foreign policy. And the headline of this, the title is "A Return to Great Power Rivalry." So, rivalry, crisis and fragmentation. We got a sober version of that from the opposition leader in the Senate, the Shadow Foreign Minister, Simon Birmingham. He comes from South Australia. So he travels on the same plane in the front seat as his mirror image, in a sense, the government leader in the Senate, the Foreign Minister, who is also from South Australia, Penny Wong. And in some ways, that mirror effect translated in the speech, because most of what the Labor Shadow Foreign Minister gave us today, you would get quite happily in a speech, the Shadow Liberal Foreign Minister, you would get in a speech from the Labor Foreign Minister. There was not much there that Penny would disagree with. There was one Birmingham kick at Labor for running down defence spending under Julia Gillard, but really the only political point was that, which was about something that happened a decade ago. He even gave a shout out to a Dr. K. Rudd, who does something for us in Washington. So when the Liberals are being nice about Kevin Rudd, you know that consensus is really working its way through the waters. And a core take on this, I think, is that tough times do drive Australia's governing parties closer together on foreign policy. Pressure can compress and enforce consensus. And if they get consensus on foreign policy, that's an issue they can put aside while they go off and do all the other domestic politics that they war about. But I really do think that consensus on foreign policy, which we've seen from both sides of Australian politics, pressure has really stabilised it. The two parties are equally careful in the way they talk about China. It's really illuminating how often they don't actually say that word that starts with C and ends with A and it ain't Cuba. Birmingham referred to things that China is doing and things that China may do, but hardly used the name. Penny is much the same. It's as though we don't want to poke the panda or something, I don't know. But it's interesting how seldom they actually talk about it directly. So that Birmingham was happy to blast away at Russia, really give Russia a big go. And one of his interesting lines, fascinating line, was to group the Philippines and Ukraine as nations facing aggression and war. Very interesting sentence. Didn't then go on to talk about the country that begins with C and A and ends with A, that would be the... But, he refers to it but doesn't follow the thought, which tells you something about the way Australia is seeking balance with China. The polity in this town is really intent on not poking the panda because it gave us a lot of pain. It took 5 years of tough sledding to get past that icy period with China, the coldest, iciest period we've had since diplomatic relations, and they don't want to go back to that. So that's a language element which you always need to bear in mind, that what they don't talk about doesn't necessarily mean it's not what they're thinking about. On the fragmentation theme, the Shadow Foreign Minister said, multipolarity arrives, war is waged, and distrust fuels military build-up. And on the election of Donald Trump, he said the obvious. The Donald will be less predictable, he will be a disruptor. And his advice is that Australia should not catastrophise. I think that's the way you pronounce it. The translation is, don't present a situation as worse than it actually is. Good advice for a diplomat, not necessarily good advice for a politician, but useful anyway. And Birmingham quoted our man in Washington, Dr. Rudd, on the need to chill out on fears about Trumpageddon. So from that balanced, careful political discussion, turn to Dr. Heather Smith for some typical Heather truth-telling. Interesting observation from Heather about how Xi Jinping has visited every Australian state, and her line that no Australian politician has an understanding of China that Xi Jinping has of Australia. Interesting view of an Asian leader with a view on Australia that developed. There aren't that many leaders in Asia's history you could say that about. Maybe, I don't know, Lee Kuan Yew had a set of views about Australia, but that a Chinese leader has visited every Australian state and has clear views on what he thinks about Australia. It's interesting insight. Some other Heather truths. Our region is the epicentre of global competition. First time in 500 years, but it's true. Economic policy is weaponised. China's economy is seriously unbalanced. The United States will accelerate the international fragmentation as it retreats from multilateralism, and national security has become the dominant priority. The economic and foreign policy boundaries have blurred, and economics no longer rules the roost. And Heather's critique of her fellow economists is that they have been naive or late to recognise how much our strategic circumstances have deteriorated. Her equal critique of the strategists, too prone to see the world in black and white. Now, at the launch of this volume, one of the editors, Professor Bungang He, hit, I think, some pretty optimistic notes about China. In fact, I'd say he was probably one of the most optimistic people on China we heard all day. And he made the argument, which I think has a certain sort of psychological insight about Trump and about Xi, that Trump is pragmatic and is transactional, and he will remove ideology from the struggle. There'll be no Trump lectures to Beijing about democracy. And don't underestimate how much that matters to Beijing. And I thought his line was that Xi Jinping will look forward to an ideology-free bilateral relationship with a Trump White House. And that opens up some space. And as he said, a peace dialogue between Xi and Trump next year will be one of the most consequential exchanges for the course of this decade and this century. Probably the one really optimistic bit we got today about Trump. So, Professor, we thank you. The South Pacific session had familiar lessons for Oz. Turn up, listen, listen. Or as I always used to translate it, for God's sake, get there and drink the kava. And the beauty of drinking the kava, I always said, was that it deadens your lips. So it actually makes those bloody Australians shut up for a while and they can listen to what they're being told. And I often thought one reason one of our great diplomats in the South Pacific, Greg Irwin, used to say he loved feeding kava to Australian politicians, one, because they hated the taste, but secondly, because it made them shut up for a while. But then Greg had an impish sense of humour. The other point I thought, the other point, that climate change will drive the tensions between Australia's relationship with the Pacific and Australia's relationship with Asia, fundamentally, because the Asian message to Australia from the Japanese and everybody else is dig, dig, dig. We want those minerals, we want that energy. Now, that is a very different conversation to what we're having in the South Pacific. And the vivid story, the really vivid story, the village in Papua New Guinea on the coast that has to move because of what climate change is doing to sea levels. And the great problem is, where do the people of that displaced village go to? Because the place of land ownership and land in Papua New Guinea means that no other village is going to give up land to those displaced villages. I mean, all of those knock-on effects. I thought that was a really important story. Another element is the impact that Australian generosity, the proper move by Australia to open its doors to Pacific labour, which we should have been doing a long time ago, which we're now doing properly. But the problem with that is, as Australia opens its doors to Pacific labour, is the number of islanders who come here, who stay, who live here, and the brain drain effect on the South Pacific. So, you know, the old Labor line, no good turn goes unpunished. Now, discussing Australia in Asia, Dr. Amy King, I was really struck by her point about her lamentation, in a way, about how fear of China has really warped the Australian debate. And as an academic, she finds her efforts to understand China expose her to all sorts of suspicions and questions from the Australian system, and questions about her students. Understanding China, Amy argued, does not translate to support for China. And my aside on that, on what Amy described about what had been happening in the university system, took me back to that Cold War era that I can remember. And we are indeed in a new Cold War when the spooks start forcing universities to do loyalty tests, and when the academics have to be questioned about what they're doing and the status of the students is being checked. So it's the old line, you know, you stare into the abyss and the abyss will stare back. And sometimes you've got to be careful about the fears that you're grappling with, because the fears become you. Professor Anthony Milner commented that many in Southeast Asia are puzzled by why Australia is so antagonistic to China. Why does Australia go so hard given the massive economic benefits it draws from China? And hey, Australia doesn't actually live hard up against China the way that ASEAN does. On that, Dr. James Chin said that ASEAN doesn't want to do neutrality in that wonderful ASEAN way, it just doesn't want to have to talk about it. The ASEAN solution. ASEAN works always to maintain ASEAN centrality, however that's defined. But James did make the point that ASEAN centrality will be one of the many things that blows up and goes away if things do blow up in the South China Sea. So that ASEAN willingness to step back isn't always going to work. And for Australia and Asia, James said, unfortunately I think, but accurately, as you'd expect from James, that our image in the region is back to the old label, we are again America's deputy sheriff. For the region, that is the meaning of AUKUS and the Quad. And that's a label that limits us in many, many ways, but I think he's probably right. We got a wonderful definition of the different strategic personalities of Australia and Indonesia from Dr. Gatra Primiyantra. Why have Australia and Indonesia responded so differently to the rise of China? And Gatra's answer is that for Indonesia, the big issues of insecurity and instability are always internal for Indonesia. Australia, the lucky country, we see all our challenges as external and coming from outside our borders. Lucky country indeed. It's a fascinating observation on the views from Jakarta and Canberra and typical Gatra smarts. The zinger from the multilateralism panel was, we are living in a Westphalian world of states, but we don't have a Treaty of Westphalia to help us to navigate. And that's a wonderful judgment on fragmentation from Dr. Shashi Tharoor. And it leads us to the final session that you've just been through. So let's very quickly pick out some big thoughts from the closing plenary. Peter Dean. The US vote is not a vote for Trumpism. America's looked at their economy and at their lives, not at issues of political cohesion. Play Trump one pitch at a time because nobody knows where the ball is going to go, not even Donald. Melissa Conley-Tyler, and who knew that Melissa could do rap? Who knew Melissa could rap? Count out the US on lots of issues. Count out the US. But don't give too much attention to the 24-hour Trump show because our focus must be Asia. Now, Mike Pizzullo, it's always interesting to see the Pizzullo blue sky, see where Mike goes. The US over the next 4 years will remain the most powerful nation in the world. Xi Jinping is strangling Chinese capitalism, said Mike. And a big Pizzullo call, and it's always interesting when Mike does big Pizzullo calls, Xi might be China's Gorbachev, the man who blows up the system. Now, Hugh answered that a rich China is not a poor Soviet Union. But I think the central Hugh White point was Australia faces the biggest shift in its international circumstances since that first fleet dropped anchor in 1788. Our future will be decided in Asia, not in Washington, and shifts don't get much bigger than that. So, this conference is about a world on the turn, a new troubled era. And I think future big histories will probably use the COVID pandemic as the dividing line, that moment that marked the end of the great golden age of globalisation that we've all drawn so many benefits from over the last couple of decades. So how do we describe this new era that is breaking around us? Now, a good writing answer when confronting one of those biggies is to turn to the playwrights and to the poets. I was very tempted to go with Middleton's cynical, amoral play about Jacobean London, A Mad World, My Masters. But I put that to you perhaps as next year's conference title, Bryce, maybe. Better, I think, to go to the 19th century poem by Matthew Arnold as he confronted revolution, both industrial and political, and captured, I think, times that really speak to much of what we're thinking about now. And Matthew Arnold wrote about wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born, with nowhere yet to rest my head, like these on earth I wait forlorn. And then Matthew Arnold gave us that dilemma about the world struggling to be born and our fragmenting era. Years hence, perhaps, may dawn an age more fortunate, alas, than we, which without hardness will be sage, and gay without frivolity. Sons of the world, oh speed those years, but while we wait, allow our tears. Thank you. All right, A Mad World, My Masters.
Who needs ChatGPT to write your conference titles when you've got Graham Nobel? Great, so we've heard rap and poetry and a great summation of the conference so far. And now we're going to have a discussion of what we could be doing in future with my friend, Dawina Tia-Motwani. We've known Dawina for some time at the AIIA. She used to be an intern here. She was for several months the editor of, back when it was edited by interns, of Australian Outlook, our online publication. And she really stepped it up, showed us what we could be doing with Australian Outlook. So it's always great to welcome her back. She's also a very good writer. She's written pieces which have been the most read in, I think, 2020 in the Lowy Interpreter. And at the moment, she's a senior policy and advocacy advisor at Power Housing Australia and advocates for social issues. So I'll turn it over to Dawina.
A very good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dawina Motwani, and I have the honor of sharing a youth perspective on this year's conference theme. Based on my experience in developing policy advice on public health and community housing, I have witnessed firsthand how disjointed systems can leave people, especially young people, to struggle. As a young person, it feels like we are inheriting a world that is increasingly fragmented. And this vulnerability isn't just felt here, it's felt globally. I see this year's conference theme as an opportunity to reimagine our approach to challenges. We must not act in isolation, but through collaboration, and young people know this all too well. In our region, we face immense challenges. Climate change threatening entire communities, where I and other members of the Indo-Pacific Cooperation Network witnessed villages in Fiji being swallowed by rising sea levels that continue as a result of poor government action. Economic inequality continues to widen, and international alliances appear to be constantly shifting, leaving my generation to question the legitimacy of institutions that were set up to enhance security and thereby promote peace. A recent survey of nearly 20,000 young Australians aged 15 to 19 years indicated that their top concerns are the environment, equity and discrimination, financial matters, and mental health. The effects of climate change are particularly urgent, with 6 in 10 young Australians deeply worried about its impact. This anxiety is warranted. 74% believe climate change will make their lives more challenging, and they overwhelmingly feel the federal government should take more aggressive action. Another poll revealed that most young Australians want the country to prioritize climate action over competition with China, viewing regional collaboration on climate change as essential for security. Young people see climate finance and direct support to affected nations not as charity, but as moral duty. Just this past August, the Australia-Tuvalu Union Treaty entered into force, allowing 280 Tuvaluan citizens to resettle in Australia each year due to rising climate threats. Yet, many young Tuvaluans remain wary of Australia's continued support for fossil fuels, a concern that was echoed by Tuvalu's climate change minister, who stated, "Fossil fuels are killing us. Opening, subsidizing, and exporting fossil fuels is immoral and unacceptable." Young Australians are urging their leaders to transition decisively from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, following the guidance of experts on climate action. While discussions about alliances like AUKUS and the Quad are important, they often overlook this environmental perspective. Young people are asking for a broader vision of security, one that includes environmental resilience as a cornerstone of stability in the Indo-Pacific. As for multilateralism, young people are increasingly concerned about its erosion amid rising global tensions. Most believe in the importance of these frameworks that have fostered decades of relative peace. They see climate collaboration, not competition, as the key to restoring faith in these institutions. Finally, the discussion of Australia's alliances and its future partnership with the US, especially regarding whether the US can sustain its regional influence, raises questions about reliability and long-term stability. For young people, reliance on any one nation is seen as risky in an era of shifting priorities. Diversified partnerships that allow for flexibility and adaptability will enable Australia to effectively respond to evolving regional dynamics without being overly reliant on any single ally. So, as we reflect on how to face fragmentation, let's recognize that young people view these challenges through a lens of connection, resilience, and shared responsibility. For us, the path forward isn't simply about surviving fragmentation. It's about transforming it into a more connected, cohesive world. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so that brings us to the end, and it's now on me to do some housekeeping and to sell some books. And, of course, to thank our wonderful supporters. In terms of our book, as Graham has so effectively plugged it, this is, of course, Australia and World Affairs. We're very, very proud of this volume. It's taken us a long time to publish. We had to negotiate through the pandemic with four different publishers, but we finally got a deal where the whole thing is the whole, by which I mean the whole series, going back to 1950, is now available online through Cambridge University Press, and all the back volumes are available on order. They're print on order. So that's a wonderful result, and we're very, very happy with it. This volume, as well as several other volumes, are still on sale downstairs in one of the courtyard rooms. Our national office manager, Matur Chalwa, is down there waiting for you to show up and buy a few copies. And he's also got bundles as well. Now, though, I'd like to acknowledge our donors. I don't have a clicker, so I hope our friends there can help us out. Our first donor, our first sponsor, of the conference is the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I'd like to acknowledge, although I can't see him sitting there, Bertil Wenger, who is a great friend. It's probably the last time he'll be present at this conference because, of course, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, being a German-based organisation, tend to circle their staff back to Germany, and so it's great to have been working with him for several years, and to get to know him and his family. Our next sponsor is DFAT, the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Of course, we have a long relationship with them. DFAT, of course, we couldn't do the work that we do without yearly support from DFAT, as well as support for particular projects. The next sponsor, I believe, is the Japan Foundation. That's correct. The Japan Foundation helps us by supporting our Indo-Pacific Cooperation Network, and we're very, very thankful for, of course, the financial support that they give us, but the fact that we have 30 members of a team from around the Indo-Pacific, Cohort 1 and Cohort 2 of the Indo-Pacific Cooperation Network, and we have taken them around the region to study disaster resilience in Japan, in Australia, and in the South Pacific as well. And I'm very, very happy to be working with them, and I acknowledge Junko Kurata, who is here today. Our diplomatic partner, I think, is, can we have the next slide? Oh, sorry, no, our airline partner is Fiji Airways, and the reason that we have such great representation from the Pacific here today is because they do offer us free flights as part of their package. I don't know if many of you know this, and many of you do live in Canberra, but Nandi is one of the few places you can fly directly to from Canberra via Fiji Airways. So if you're going to the States, or if you're going to Japan, you're going to have to fly through Sydney or Melbourne or somewhere else anyway, so it may as well be Nandi. You can take a day off. They want me to tell you that. Okay, and next, I think, is our diplomatic partner. Yeah, we're very, very fortunate. As we do every year, we try to seek a different diplomatic partner every year to sponsor a reception that we held last night after our masterclasses. And this year, we had a wonderful reception at the residence of the Ambassador of the Kingdom of Netherlands, and I thank Ambassador Ardi Stoyersbacher for that. Could we have the next slide, please? So there are numerous organisations who supported the masterclasses yesterday. The venue supporter was the Australian National University Coral Bell School of Asia Affairs. They've been doing this for several years now, and it's wonderful that we can use their premises. The masterclasses, for those who were not part of them, are quite an involved project. We have several classes running simultaneously, and it's great to have a venue where we can use several rooms. We also have support again this year from the New Colombo Plan, who have sent students to the masterclasses and here to the conference. Griffith University came on board for the first time this year. We have wonderful support, consecutive yearly support from the University of Queensland, and I acknowledge Diana McCluskey, who is here in the room, and also University of Canberra and in particular their Piranhas Club stands for something to do with international relations. I don't quite know, but they are a wonderful supporter. Importantly, I'd also like to thank my staff. I go to conferences like this quite a lot, actually, and I went to one in Europe recently, and the director took a photo of his staff after the conference, and there were like 30 of them that helped them out. I have 3. Emily Mosley, my National Operations Manager, Hebe Wren, my new National Office Assistant, and Madhur Chalwa, my National Office Manager. And they've been working so hard these past few months, it's been fantastic. So I'd like you to give them a hand, please. If you think I should have more staff, by the way, there is a big donate button on our website you can press. I'd also like to thank our interns. Of course, we have 3 intern intakes across the year, and the intake at this time does get to work on the conference, and it is probably, well, it is the busiest time that we have. So I'd like to thank Adrian Liu, Nikki Truwin, Daiki Sato, and Jennifer Stannard, and also a former intern who came back to help us out with this conference, Dorothee Steinbach. Thanks very much, guys. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you. It is through the participation of ordinary Australians as well as experts and practitioners that this institute thrives. We can't do it without you. We are a membership-based organisation. If you're not a member yet, maybe we've got some work to do, but maybe you have too. If you go to our website, you can find the membership portal. And we would love to see you back again next year. I don't know if I'll accept, or I'll have to think about whether Graham's suggestion for a title was what we want to do, but no doubt you will find out our title fairly soon. We usually decide it early in the year, and we'll be hoping that you will come back. So thanks very much, everybody.